Welcome everybody to another episode of the MakdisiStreet podcast. Sadi, Osama, and Kareem are here with you, and we're happy to welcome our friend and colleague Sharif Abdel Kouddous to the show. Sharif is a journalist and the Middle East and North Africa editor at Dropsite News. He's reported from across the Arab world, including Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Bahrain, and Algeria, as well as from across the US and internationally. He received a Peabody Award for his Gaza documentary, The Night Won't End, a George Polk Award for his investigation into the killing of Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, an Emmy Award for his coverage of the Trump administration's Muslim travel ban, and an Izzy Award for his coverage of the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. Sharif is also producer of the Palestine Festival of Literature, PalFest, and he's based in and between New York and Cairo. So, Sharif, welcome to the show. Ahlan, it's great to have you here. We thought we'd begin by asking what's been happening in Gaza since the so-called ceasefire, took effect, and what is the status of the territory now? We know, although most consumers of mainstream news wouldn't know, that the Israelis are bombing and killing in Gaza essentially every single day. They've killed hundreds of people since this so-called ceasefire went into effect. They're demolishing buildings and so on. But maybe you can give us a sort of fuller account of where are we in Gaza? What's been happening, and what does the kind of immediate, short-term, reality look like in Gaza?
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm a fan of this podcast and of all your work. I think it's important to understand that since the so-called ceasefire on October 10th went into effect, the genocide has continued. This is not something that has ended. Even groups like Amnesty International have said the genocide has continued. Palestinians are being killed in direct attacks nearly every single day by the Israeli military. Almost 500 have been killed since October 10th. Just today, as we're speaking, a 12-year-old newborn froze to death. Another one from exposure to cold that brings the number of children who have died of hypothermia just this winter season alone to 11. Over 24 people have been killed in building collapses because no reconstruction materials are allowed in, and people are taking shelter in very heavily damaged buildings, and walls and buildings collapse on tents or collapse on them inside these ground floors, and they're being killed. Tens of thousands of tents have been destroyed, and people are literally just being exposed to the elements. And so this genocidal assault has not stopped. What has changed since the ceasefire is a couple of things. First of all, the Israeli military withdrew to what we now understand is called the Yellow Line. This was negotiated as part of the talks, and it leaves the Israeli military officially in control of 53% of Gaza. That's kind of like the line on Israeli maps. And this has effectively cleaved Gaza in half. So you have one half where the Israeli military is in control, and another half where the majority of Palestinians are crammed into an even smaller space in a wasteland that's kind of under constant assault, doesn't have enough food, and no shelter. And what the Israeli military has been doing in the half that it controls appears to be creating facts on the ground, as Israel always does, that will eventually become permanent. So if we want to just back up a little bit, essentially we saw last week the official launch of the so-called Board of Peace by President Donald Trump. And we can talk about the structure of that Board of Peace a little later. But, during that presentation, Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, delivered a presentation of what he called the master plan for the redevelopment of Gaza. And, also one of the slides had Arabic script that was written in reverse from left to right, and it wasn't connected. This shows you the level of incompetence, but these are the people that are engineering the future of Gaza. And he said, we're not going to have a Hamas zone and a free zone. And what he was referring to was those two sides of the yellow line, the side that Israel controls and the side that where most Palestinians live. He said, we're going for catastrophic success. That's the term he used. And he put up a rendering of a map of Gaza that shows these kind of like, different residential communities. And it's the entire Gaza Strip. But that doesn't seem to be what the Israeli military is doing. What we know that they have done since October 10th is that they are consolidating and constructing military infrastructure in the half that it controls. So they have built at least 13 new military outposts in the half that it controls. There's something now like 50 military outposts in that area. They're expanding a road network and building new roads, and they're connecting these roads inside Gaza to bases, military bases, and settlements outside of Gaza. So they're basically, creating these facts on the ground, which look like it's going to be a permanent presence in this half of Gaza. And also, we've been doing a lot of work with forensic architecture and publishing their findings. Previously, the yellow line, the so-called yellow line, was only drawn in Israeli maps or delineated by the military's placement of yellow blocks, physical yellow blocks in Gaza, of which there are at least something like 38 of them. Israel has been moving these yellow blocks, sometimes hundreds of meters further into Gaza, past the line that's drawn on its own maps, taking even more Palestinian land. Gaza is very narrow. And what we understand now is that since December, they've actually been building earth berms, so like large mounds of earth along the yellow line that is turning it into a physical barrier. So they're really cutting Gaza in half. And this physical border, basically, in addition to all of this construction of military infrastructure, they're also engaged in destruction of Palestinian property and Palestinian buildings and hospitals and demolition across this area. And so, and they are now, and we can get into this. They're now constructing what's called a first planned community, and so this is kind of like the housing zones that really paint kind of a very frightening and horrifying picture of what the future they envision for a new generation of dispossessed Palestinians in Gaza, and how they will live, how they will be controlled, and a sort of privatized colonial space where they hope to corral, I think, most Palestinians in Gaza.
I mean, Sharif, you just described and laid out as truly a dystopian, sort of a nightmarish scenario that, of course, is unfolding. And so, I guess the question is, what is the connection between this so-called Kushner plan, this master plan of Gaza that you alluded to earlier, and the Israeli reality on the ground? And then what are and then where is Hamas in all this? I guess
it's hard to know how seriously to take the Kushner plan that we saw last week. I think it's a combination of these things that, this first planned community that's being planned does have U.S. buy-in, and we can explain why. So basically, last week or earlier this month, on January 14th, the Civil Military Coordination Center, or the CMCC, held a presentation for the so-called first planned community. Now, the CMCC is established by U.S. Central Command, which is CENTCOM. It was established 1 week after the ceasefire, and it's headquartered in this, large warehouse-style building in southern Israel, and it involves dozens of countries, dozens of NGOs and different organizations. It's led by a U.S. Lieutenant Army General. And its mandate is it's supposed to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire and monitor the entry of aid, supposedly. And this presentation that they held last week was for this so-called, what they called a Gaza's first planned community. So this is a US presentation. So, this is what they envision for a site that is going to, according to the presentation, house up to 25,000 Palestinians. This is within the Israeli controlled zone. And actually, through forensic architecture, they also did another analysis of satellite imagery. They've been engaged in the systematic destruction on the 50% of Gaza that they control. But there's one site, 1 square kilometer, between 2 military corridors in Rafah, where they're engaged in a pattern that we don't see anywhere else in Gaza. And that pattern is raising the land, compacting the ground, and removing the rubble. And this suggests that this is the site they're beginning to build this planned community. And what this presentation by the CMCC, which analysts say had to also have Israeli buy-in, they wouldn't have had this huge presentation without kind of Israeli buy-in for it, lays out a set of criteria about how this community will be run. And it goes through everything. It goes through policies regarding municipality, the economy, health, education, law and order. And we can talk about kind of, what this vision is. So it provides a set of criteria for which Palestinians will be, quote, invited to live there. And that will involve undergoing security checks to prevent the entry of what they called, quote, Hamas elements. So it doesn't say who's doing the security vetting, but historically any security vetting of Palestinians in Gaza to leave or enter the territory has been done by Kogat, which is the branch of the Israeli military that oversees the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Another, for example, criteria of which Palestinians should live there, they say intact extended families are preferred to enable mutual aid and prevent friction. Now, is there a single intact extended family in Gaza after over 2 years of genocide? They have wiped out over 2,700 families in Gaza. There are over 6,000 Palestinians in Gaza who are the sole survivors of their entire bloodlines. This kind of language is used throughout. I'll give you a couple more examples where it's kind of, there's an element of erasure of what's happened over the last 2 years with this genocidal violence that is just kind of ignored and stepped over. They want intact extended families. Really, I don't think there is one intact extended family in Gaza. But then kind of to go to the bricks and mortar of it, to enter these zones, residential zones or planned communities, they'd have to pass through a security checkpoint. Everyone entering will have to be registered with biometric documentation. And that biometric documentation will enable people to not only move around, but to access services. So to access, and when I say services, these are life essentials, food and shelter and things like this. And this registry of biometric data will be based on your Palestinian ID number, which is issued by authorities in coordination with Kogat. So the Israeli military, which already has an incredible amount of monitoring and surveillance of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, this gives them another layer of documentation through biometrics. On the economy, it increases surveillance of all economic activity by basing it on what they called electronic shekel wallets. So this replaces Gaza's largely cash-based economy with a purely electronic transaction economy, which they can again control and monitor. And then there's more kind of insidious things that are outlined. So for example, first of all, this first planned community is referred to in the presentation as the Emirati compound. It's unclear why they named it that. There is the Emirati field hospital nearby. There's reporting by The Guardian showing that the UAE is going to be funding the construction of this first zone. But under the education portion of the presentation, it says that they should create a curriculum that is not Hamas-based, but that will follow, quote, culture of peace principles modeled after the UAE. Now that phrase, a culture of peace, is mentioned in the normalization agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel that was signed in 2020 as part of the Abraham Accords. And as we know, since then, the UAE has normalized relations with Israel more than any other Arab country. They have incredible levels of trade, of tourism, defense deals, security deals, tech deals, with surveillance, defense cooperation. So this, this idea seems aimed at promoting an Emirati-inspired re-education program, basically to promote the idea of normalization with Israel. And there's other criteria, but this is kind of the vision that's laid out. And that's essentially what's to come. You'll have these, at least in the immediate future, these housing zones that are being built where Israel and other foreign bodies, like the Board of Peace, and we can get into that, have complete economic, social, and security control over this new generation of dispossessed Palestinians. And they're corralled into these spaces where they have to comply in order to survive. In the other half of Gaza, those who aren't invited, on the other side of the so-called yellow line, they'll be left in a wasteland where they're under constant assault by Israeli bombs, as we see every day now, with restricted food, restricted aid, restricted life essentials, no shelter, and kind of try to eke out survival in conditions of genocide. And that's kind of the future that they're trying to build at the moment, this green zone and red zone, under this kind of colonial mandate structure that we've seen called the Board of Peace.
Sharif, this is, I mean, again, as Osama said, what you're describing is it's like a sci-fi dystopian nightmare, basically. But there are a few questions to be asked about it. For one thing, the ultimate Zionist sort of fantasy is that the Palestinians just disappear somehow. So clearly, this is not that. In other words, there's still going to be Palestinians there. So then the fallback Zionist fantasy, and these people have a very active fantasy life, but the fallback fantasy is that Palestinians can be controlled down to the last hair. So they know everything about you. They know every time you breathe, they know where you are. This is, of course, it's a fantasy. It doesn't mean it's going to be realized, but this is how they fantasize about controlling people down to the last molecule, almost literally. So one question is, and I'm going to ask you a series of questions here, if you don't mind, because they're all kind of tied with each other. So one question is, to what extent is this fantasy, and to what extent do you think it's realizable? But then the two immediate questions that follow are, we're going to put up for viewers, so for people who are watching online, obviously they'll be able to see maps. We're going to add maps. For those of you who are listening on the audio version of the podcast, we can append maps, I guess, in the notes so you can see what this map looks like. But the yellow line that Sharif has been describing runs, if you think of Gaza as a coastal strip, the yellow line sort of bisects the strip, roughly bisects it, but parallel to the sea, essentially. And so the place where the Palestinians are now crammed is on the sea side of the yellow line. Whereas this first planned community, by all accounts, seems to be near Rafah, so it's on the Israeli side, so to speak, of the land side of the yellow line. So it seems like if the plan is for them to expel everybody to this sort of Mad Max wilderness of the coastal strip and bomb them and kill them, keep their lives as miserable as possible, and then to admit them almost like one by one into the land side of the thing. It seems that they're, in a way, according to the Kushner plan, they're doing it, and it's flipped around, because Kushner always, for years, has been talking about the coastal property as this is the prime real estate. But they're kind of inverting it. So in other words, the Israelis, in this case, if they were to follow this through, they'd be bringing more and more Palestinians closer to them, so to speak, than further away from them, which seems like, in a way, opposite from what the Israelis want to do. So to what extent do you think this is fantasy, and to what extent do you think what I just described maybe contradicts, has one Israeli fantasy contradicting another Israeli fantasy, and then how real do you think this actually is? Because it sounds terrifyingly real, but you're maybe in a better position to assess that than I am.
Look, with anything, it's always hard to predict. A few days after October 7th, or maybe it was the evening of October 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took to the airwaves announcing the war on Gaza. And he's told all Palestinians in Gaza, leave now. That's how the war started. This genocide started. He said, leave now. And then we saw a week later, this decree ordering half of the Palestinians in Gaza, over 1 million people, to evacuate to the south. And they published, a map showing these two arrows pointing south towards basically Egypt. And that looked like a manifestation of colonial fantasy. And there has been, I think when we talk about Gaza, as the three of you know, the Gaza Strip is a colonial construct, right? Gaza was a city like any other Palestinian city. It was a very important historical trading route. It was a prosperous part of southern Palestine up until 1948. But, in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes by Zionist militias, many of those in southern Palestine took refuge, some of them behind the retreating Egyptian army, and which ended up controlling this area we now call the Gaza Strip, right? Which was obviously invaded and occupied by Israel in 1967. But you have this massive concentration of Palestinian refugees in Gaza that becomes a site of particular intense colonial violence. Not just since Hamas was ruling the territory in 2007 or 2006, but because there's this largest concentration of Palestinian refugees in historic Palestine. So it's both the site of historically colonial violence, kind of the most intense, and the focal site of fierce Palestinian resistance. The first Intifada started there. It's where Yasser Arafat returned to in 1994. It's where Hamas and Jihad were founded. So I think we're at this fulcrum point. We're at a pivotal point now where you've had these different stages. And I'm just focusing on Gaza. Obviously, there's the rest of Palestine, but where we're at a pivotal point yet again. And Palestine and Gaza in particular is this laboratory for what is possible for this colonial expansion. And whether, so they have control of this side, of the eastern side. The Israeli forces have this control. I'm sure their fantasy is to take over the entire strip, to force all Palestinians out. It's hard. And there's a lot of despair over what's happening, but also I think we have to remember that Palestinian resistance and steadfastness and just the existence of Palestinians in historic Palestine has caused, we can argue, the Zionist project, or as it was initially envisioned, to fail, to become some normalized state that kind of rules over a subjugated population, but is accepted. It got pushed into, maybe it was always going into the direction of genocidal violence and erasure, complete erasure. But it's in this state now where it's in a state of constant war, genocidal violence, and it'll never be accepted as kind of like a normal, quote unquote, normal state. The whole world is changing, and we can, whatever normal means. But sorry, I'm going a bit off track here, but Palestine in many ways is kind of a fulcrum for the world. And this is actually manifesting in how we look at how Gaza is now being controlled. There is a new colonial mandate to control Gaza called the Board of Peace, right? It was launched by President Trump. The charter of the Board of Peace makes no mention of Palestine or Gaza or Palestinian people or right of return or self-determination. It does make Trump chairman for life, ostensibly. He can only be replaced if he resigns, or if every other member of the Board of Peace, in a unanimous decision, votes him out, which is kind of unattainable. And he has exclusive authority to veto any decisions, to appoint member states, and so forth. So you have this Board of Peace, and we just published at Dropsite the first resolution. We got a copy of the draft resolution of the Board of Peace, where it formalizes the hierarchical structure of this bureaucracy, essentially. So you have the Board of Peace, which has ministers and heads of state joining, and Trump is the chairman. There are no Palestinians in the Board of Peace. Trump did invite a spot for Netanyahu, who remains under war crimes indictment for war crimes committed in the genocide in Gaza. Beneath the Board of Peace, you have what's called the Executive Board. The Executive Board is supposed to have full powers and implement and oversee and direct policy. On this Executive Board are people like, outright Zionists, people like Jared Kushner, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Tony Blair, this guy Marty Edelman. It's also got businessmen on it, and there's a privatization aspect of this new colonial kind of structure. Under that, there's something called the Gaza Executive Board, and this includes a lot of the same members as the Executive Board, but it also includes more businessmen, and they're supposed to serve in an advisory capacity. You also have something called the High Representative. You have what's called the International Stabilization Force, which is not made yet. So you have all of these things, and then at the very bottom of the totem pole, you have what's called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. And this is made up of Palestinian technocrats that are supposed to implement some of these policies. So you have this incredibly bureaucratic structure that is completely controlled by, it's a foreign body that has complete control over Gaza. And what this resolution said was basically that this governing authority would assume full legislative, executive, and judicial control over Gaza, including emergency powers. Okay? The mandate is to transform Gaza into, quote, a de-radicalized and demilitarized terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. And what's perhaps most frightening in the text of this resolution is this idea of eligibility. The eligibility to participate by Palestinians, to participate in economic, humanitarian, political life in Gaza. It conditions the ability to survive with compliance to this so-called New Gaza plan, this comprehensive plan. That's what it's termed. It says, people can't have demonstrated a history of collaboration with groups like Hamas, or what they call terror groups, and so it's conditioning, basically, yes, survival on compliance. There's other things in this resolution, but that's kind of like the structure that's being built. And as we're speaking, the crossing, the Rafah border crossing, is supposed to open for what they said was a partial reopening for pedestrian traffic only. This is after the remains of the last Israeli captive were recovered in Gaza. And I tell you this, the remains of the last Israeli captive. I am working with journalists in Gaza as part of my job as an editor. The story that I've been working on a couple of days is a man named Abu Ismail, who is in the Sabra neighborhood of Gaza City, whose family, his entire family, his wife, 6 children, his brother, and all his children were all killed in December of 2023. He has since late 2024, when he could return to his neighborhood, been digging for their remains. He uses a flour sifter, picks up sand, puts it in, and sifts, and picks out bone fragments, and is painstakingly collecting the fragments of his family. And the world is covering the remains of the last Israeli captive, where I just saw reporting that they destroyed a cemetery as they were looking and digging up and exhuming graves as they're looking for this. And this is also, they can move on to so-called stage 2, and which they never have, and they should have, to open up the crossings and allow in more aid. So it's really this dystopic, a future that's coming together. And it's also, and the last thing I'll say is, the Board of Peace, its charter, and there's been reporting and writing about this, is not limited to Palestine, right? It's some say it's going to replace the UN, as ineffective as the UN has been, but that this is kind of the new way, that the new global order, basically. And it also points to the way that Palestine is this like fulcrum for the world.
Yeah, Sharif, thanks. Again, very dystopian and very, frankly, very, very depressing to hear all of this. And just to your last point, it's true that, at least as far as I can tell, the UN Security Council hasn't said anything, right? Have they commented anything on this latest plan? I don't think anything. I don't know if
on
there
this
were
plan,
any
no,
debates
but the Security Council, in a shocking vote, is the one that authorized this Board of Peace.
Right.
I can't think of another example in UN history where they authorized a foreign force, not a UN peacekeeping force, a foreign force to occupy a country. It's shocking. So no, I don't think they formalized. Well, I mean, they formalized it that way.
They had also authorized the International Stabilization Force. I think you mentioned. Has there been any update on that in terms of any countries accepting to be part of this? Or is that just stalled at this point, and we assume?
There's been a lot of discussion back and forth of, who Israel will accept. Will they allow Turkish troops? How will Egypt be involved? There's, supposedly also Palestinians being trained in Egypt to be part of a future police force. It's unclear how this will work. And also, at the end of the day, the Israeli military is in control of that area. So, no, I don't know. I don't know how it's going to go forward. But what we do know is what's actually physically changing on the ground. And what's physically changing on the ground is that they are preparing the ground for this kind of planned community, at least in this part of Gaza that they do control.
Just a reminder to everybody that, as far as I remember, Gaza is 400 square kilometers, less 380 or so square kilometers, and that's before it gets split in two in the way that you've described it. And we're talking about a couple of million people. I mean, and it was already one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Again, before the genocide and before this business of being split into two and being increasingly pushed towards the sea in this unbelievable way, and in front of the whole world as the world kind of looks on. I want to ask Sharif to get from this megalomaniac discussion of Kushner and Tony Blair and all this kind of thing to people on the ground in terms of first of all, Hamas. So where is Hamas in all of this? What is their relationship with this new the technocratic kind of committee that's being deployed there? Is there a relationship? Are they in contact with each other, or is one supposed to be eventually operating in areas where Hamas is not allowed to be operating, and so therefore, since the whole point, as you read out, was to de-radicalize and demilitarize and put biometric people so that everybody that they don't like is I don't know, shunted out. What if you don't pass the biometric test? What happens to you? You get taken to some jail somewhere. You get evicted. It's not quite clear. But what is this relationship, and is that real? I mean, how are Palestinians reacting to this technical committee that's supposed to come in and manage kind of day-to-day operations?
I mean, I think we saw a very interesting response in statements by Hamas. I believe Jihad also put out a statement that was not that critical, wasn't actually critical at all, of not the body of the Board of Peace, but of the Palestinians who are part of what's called the National Committee for this committee of Palestinian technocrats that are kind of like at the bottom of this bureaucratic structure.
National Committee for the Administration of Gaza.
Yeah, that's it. Yes. I mean, it's, for free market people who supposedly hate bureaucracy, they've built a massive bureaucratic structure. But yes, so the statements by Palestinian resistance factions has not been to cause internal rifts. And I think, are these the people that Hamas and Jihad would have chosen? No, but there was a very long, actual months-long process that was supposed to be a democratic process of who would take over kind of like the administrative control of Gaza and help govern it and run it. And Hamas and Jihad and other Palestinian factions that took part in these discussions said, we want Palestinians, preferably from Gaza, technocrats, experts in their field. That was their position. They even said they would accept Palestinian Authority, who have Mahmoud Abbas has, consistently, he called Hamas dogs and other things. But they said, basically, we will accept kind of any Palestinian input that can have some say in engineering the future of Gaza, and that they don't want to be fighting with each other. That's been the general discourse from Hamas and Jihad, that Palestinians need unity. They completely understand that this body has no real power. In the text of the resolution, it says that this committee is operating under the authorization, direction, and supervision of the High Representative of the Board of Peace. So it's completely kind of like dominated and has no sovereignty or control. But I think there's also a sense within Palestinian factions, Palestinian resistance, that now is not the time to have an internal turf battle, and that they want some kind of outpost to operate from, to begin to try and counter this. So, yeah, there hasn't been, you would think that there would have been criticism as that they're kind of like collaborating with this new colonial mandate, but actually it's been a very nuanced response. Ali Shath is the one who is the head of this committee. He's a former PA official, and yeah, he's the one who announced by video link last week at Davos that Rafah was opening, and they're giving him that kind of, I think it was kind of like some sort of thing to have him make this announcement to oh, we're opening Rafah. So yeah, the response has been interesting. I think Hamas is not being consulted or talked to at all at this point. There's been, up until the ceasefire, yes, they're involved in negotiations and so forth. They are just ignored. What does this mean for future Palestinian resistance in these different spaces and how Gaza's being carved up? One can only wait and see. But what we do know is that Palestinian resistance has always existed, and it's not just going to go away. So how that manifests in this new kind of like privatized colonial space that they're building, we'll have to see. But I mean, it is dystopian.
It's just worth just to mention that the High Representative that Sharif was talking about is this guy, what's his name, Mladenov, right? Nikolai Mladenov,
Bulgarian.
Bulgarian, who was for quite a while, if I remember, the head of UNSCO, the UN Special Representative for Middle East Peace, or whatever it's called. So he's there. So he was always, to my knowledge, considered quite pro-Israeli, but he was on the ground and dealt with situation for many years there. So, but he's also, I think, having retired from the UN, I think he had spent his time at the UAE. So again, you have this kind of pro-Israeli, UAE-oriented guy who's there, supposed to be the special or the High Representative in Gaza. I think it's worth looking into this character as well, because I think he'll be the actual main player, as opposed to this Gaza technical thing where they'll just be, doing God knows what, but he will be more in the news and being more active as representing. This is what I understand anyway.
Following up on what Karim was just saying in terms of the, and what you were describing in terms of this truly dystopian or Orwellian, I mean, it's beyond, it's almost a parody. Well, it is a parody of the mandate system of the League of Nations after the First World War. I mean, it's just, it's obscene, actually, what you've laid out for us and for our viewers. And my question is, to what extent, when you zoom out a little bit and you look and you say, okay, but over the last 2 years plus since the genocide began, Israel has been isolated as never before in global opinion. And I'm wondering how you read that trend of ever more international isolation with this, what you're describing, which is just this kind of obscene, willful, vindictive, vicious sort of basically fuck you to the world, essentially. It's saying to the world, we will deal with this population as we see fit. Nobody can stop us. Everyone has to participate in this. And there's no such thing as rules or international law or justice or anything. So I'm wondering how you reconcile the global shift with where we are today. What's happened?
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, Osama,
go ahead.
just sorry, Sharif, but Osama, as Sharif had mentioned, the Security Council did authorize this board of peace. Right? So
but
there
as a
is an
way,
international.
but as a way, but the Security Council as a way of saying we give up, we're irrelevant, we
They
bow to
passed
Trump's
it.
will,
They
and
authorized
so
it.
yeah,
They authorized it. I mean, that's even worse. That's even worse.
Yes, but there's also been, it got passed because for some reason Russia and China abstained. That's why it passed. But I think at least when I was covering Palestine, the Second Intifada over 20 years ago, in the United States, you couldn't say the word Palestine. If you said the word Palestine, that's not a country, that's not a place, you would get attacked viciously. There was even an acronym, PEP, Progressive Except for Palestine. Now, you have a new generation. Well, a large portion of US political life that is not just on the left, but also on the right. A new generation that is not just anti-occupation, but is anti-Zionist as a colonial ideology. We saw, one of the most significant student uprisings in half a century in this country and around the world. There has been, even by some countries, condemnation of Israel as a colonial project. So, yes, what is it? Are we beginning? Is this genocide in Gaza the beginning of the end of Zionism, or is it the beginning of the annihilation of Palestine and the Palestinian people as a people? I don't know what the answer is to that. I think, as Tarek Bakoni said recently, we're at a point now where there's no kind of middle ground. There's no going back to October 6th. There is no kind of like two-state solution. There's no normalizing this. There is only justice and liberation or annihilation. Those are kind of like the two options at this point.
In a way, I mean, Sharif, based on what we're talking about now, the way you've laid out the reality facing the people in Gaza, and obviously Palestine generally, Gaza in particular, because there are different versions of more or less the same thing in the rest of Palestine too, of course, for Palestinians. But it's just going to what you just said. It seems like we're in a moment now where this is either, as we said before, this is either a pipe dream of a Zionist pipe dream of some kind. They're either fantasizing on steroids, or they're going to win. And it's basically, I mean, this is the fight for the future of humanity in a way, because of course we're seeing it most intensively in Palestine, but variations of the same struggle are taking place here in the US, as you know from what's going on in Minneapolis and other places. There is a kind of global struggle between, it is almost Manichaean, between the forces of good and of evil. I mean, in almost literally, it seems almost, sometimes when you look at it, it looks like that. Certainly what's happening in Palestine. So if evil triumphs, then Jared Kushner will make his whatever billions or whatever he's planning to make. The people of Gaza will be reduced to these wretches that are much closer in some sense to 12th century serfs, if even that. At least serfs had rights, to these automata who come and go from, and whose lives can be snuffed out at will by an overlapping master race of Israelis. I mean, it is the worst form of dystopia that anybody in the history of the world has ever cooked up, as far as I'm aware. And so either they triumph, or
I mean, is this another like?
Yeah, but I'm not saying they're going to win. I'm saying
is this
is their fantasy, right? So the question is, if their fantasy triumphs, then that's what happens, or will it be their undoing? Basically, they've gone too far. This is insane what they're doing. It's delusional. It's hubristic. It's medically insane in some way. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Hopefully, obviously, I hope that they're delusional, and that the world's outrage will only continue to grow, even though, as you've said before, they're trying to do everything possible to stop dissent and criticism and everything else. But that's the moment we're in right now. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look at the extent to which in this country they've trampled on free speech, on academic freedom, all of these things just to clamp down on dissent over Palestine. Historians like Ilan Pape argue this is the beginning of the end of Zionism. It's just a very long and brutal end and violent end. It also could be, another moment like 1967, where it is a massive reordering of the regional order. I mean, we're seeing that in Syria and Lebanon and, around the region, and different forms of control within Palestine by Israel that holds for decades. It's honestly hard to know. But I think what's clear is that I've never seen this amount of opposition to Israel, at least in the United States, in my lifetime. And I don't think it's ever going back to what it was. If you support Israel now, you have to explain yourself. And that is a sea change from where we were. And as the historian Rashid Khalidi argued, he said, every colonial project has a metropole. And the war to win, part of the battle to win and to decolonize has to be waged in the metropole. And the metropole for Israel is not Tel Aviv, it's New York and Washington. And so that battle has to be fought here. He said part of the battle to liberate Algeria was fought in Paris. And so there is something to that it takes years for opposition within, because this is hardly a democracy in many ways, but it takes a long time for political opposition at the grassroots level to filter into the halls of Washington and then eventually get enacted into policy. But it is on that track. But at the same time, yeah, you have a really vicious colonial body now that's overseeing Gaza, that is this other form of privatized extraction now that they want to build. It's incredible that the names of the people on these official bodies in the Board of Peace are real estate people and tech people, in addition to politicians. So I don't know. I always grapple with this question all the time. Like it's very hard to get a sense of what we're all witnessing, and I think we've all been changed by what we've seen. There's been genocides in the past, but never live streamed in this way, and so yeah, I think it's affected everything. Actually, it's affected a global order. It's affected, people talk about imperial boomerang with what's happening in Minnesota and so forth. I don't know that that's necessarily true in this case, but these things are undoubtedly connected. And that connection was made by a whole generation of Americans. I think especially after the Black Lives Matter protest movement in 2020, that then was followed by the unity uprising in Palestine in 2021. And they made these connections of who is the oppressor and who's the oppressed, who's the colonizer and who's the colonized. And yeah, that connection, I think, is not going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's hope, and on this podcast, we've often talked about this conundrum again about Zionism and its status in the West in general, the U.S. in particular, and we've often said, it looks like a losing proposition in the U.S. I mean, it still seems strong because it can exert power over hapless Congress people who do the bidding of the lobby, but that seems like hopefully it seems like a dwindling number, and that the popular outrage, this is certainly seen in opinion polls of Americans, as you know. It seems like a massive sea change has taken place, and that image of the little plucky little Israel, David and Goliath fighting for purity and like all this stuff, like nobody believes that stuff, or I mean a few people, but it's like a dwindling number of people from a certain generation believe that otherwise. So I think we're gonna, obviously we'll keep tracking this as we go.
But Sally, just to note, Yanni, based on what you're saying, I think they moved on. I think they've recognized and they've moved on from this idea that they can get the support of liberals in America and have that image. They've moved on to the oligarchs, and they're shutting down media in the United States. This TikTok
Yeah.
All the CBS News, this Barry Weiss, these kinds of just
that's their
extreme.
bet.
Well, it's extreme ideologues, and it is their bet. I don't know if I have no idea if that kind of thing works, or what the younger generation will be turning
Well,
to.
this is the thing. Their bet has been. We've talked about this before. Their bet. They used to be able to count on American and Western support through hegemony and through sort of people, went along with the story, as Sharif was saying, progressive accept Palestine, etc. Now their bet is they can continue to extract support from the U.S. by coercion, basically, by shutting down free speech, by destroying universities, by censorship and prohibition and so forth. That seems like a very hard thing to do. But
I just want to ask Sharif one. I think we have to wrap up, but just a question. I mean, when I'm looking at the map that the U.S. master plan for Gaza and the map, etc., and the Kushner plan, and looking at the fact that you have all these Security Council resolution, you have the International Stabilization Force that at least was planned, you have all these countries. You have a whole board of peace, and then the kind of expanded board of peace, which is using Gaza as its main thing, and then will expand presumably to other matters and other items. You are literally watching this kind of global orders being refashioned from this 350 square kilometer area, all of which kind of began through and I'm not talking about October 7th, but sort of, that there's this resistance and the Samud that's taking place in Gaza in particular. And so this entire global order being reconstructed based on this is, in the end, I mean, it is, I think, testimony to the Palestinians in general and the Palestinian resistance, the fact that they refuse to go away. I think if we need to look at something positive, it's not just what's going on in the US, it's the fact that it's simply incredible the way people simply persist. I don't know. Is it my fantasy now? Am I being just sort of
I think
idealistic and trying to find something? But
Palestine has long been, and Israel has long been kind of the most naked form of colonialism in the 21st century. Also, yes, and anachronistic. But it also, I think it was Lenin who said, imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. It also is kind of, this future that awaits us all. It is kind of the future point where everything is tested. I know you've spoken about this on the podcast before. Not only weapons and algorithms and walls and different forms of architecture and surveillance. All of these things are tested and then exported abroad, and new forms of, as the world is reorganizing, almost in a way that's transnational, that supersedes nation states, where you have just kind of oligarchy and these networks of incredibly wealthy people involved in different forms of extraction around the world. Yes, Palestine is this kind of like laboratory for that, but at the same time, yes, I think history kind of can't move forward until Palestine is free, right? And none of us can be liberated until Palestine is free, because as this continues to exist, it is kind of like this. We call it an absurd, almost parody of a colonial body now that's happening with the Board of Peace, but it is reality. But at the same time, I think across movements and different things, that those can't be defeated also until Palestine is completely defeated. And Palestine is not defeated. Palestine exists, it fights back, right? And so there is this incredible, we talk about sumud and resistance, and they can be words that we kind of become inured to, but they're very real. And the fact that there is still Palestinian resistance, there is still a Palestine, I think speaks to some sense of hope. If we're looking for something to hope for, That's it. At least for myself.
On a depressing dystopian note, let's thank you, Sharif, so much for coming on, and hopefully we can have you again in the future and follow up this conversation and see where we go. Thank you very, very much.
And thank you for all your work, Sharif.
Thank you. يعطيك العافية.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, what did you think of our conversation with Sharif? I thought it was both. Yeah, we ended on a hopeful note, obviously, but there's a lot of dystopian nightmare in there too. From what he's obviously not from him, but from what the coverage he's providing of the situation in Gaza. Osama, what did you think?
I thought it's surreal. It's obscene. I mean, the reality of what's going on now in Gaza and the discourse around it, and this kind of Trump plan and the Kushner plan, and as Karim pointed out, the UN's sort of capitulation. It's all sort of like a repeat of what happened to the League of Nations after, in the 1930s, and that's, I think, where we are right now. It's just the complete crumbling of an order in Gaza, more especially in Gaza than anywhere else, more obviously in Gaza. And then the question is, okay, so what's going to happen? Will this work? I mean, these are all big questions we don't have the answers to. But what we can say definitively, it's beyond obscene. That's all I can say. In terms of hope, I'll leave it to Karim. Karim, what do you think?
Thank you. That's. I mean, hope. This is. I mean, we're just saying it's dystopian. It's depressing beyond belief. If you look at this board, if you look at who it comprises, it's even more depressing when you look at these people. All basically real estate people, all of them extreme Zionists, all of them.
And so vulgar, Karim, right? It's just so vulgar. It's in your face.
It's vulgar. It's vulgar, and they're doing. They want to do a real estate deal. The problem is that you have all these pesky people around, and they're still going to try to find ways to get rid of you. You can be sure that's Netanyahu's plan in this, is to still try to at some point open up and find some place to push all these people. I hope, and I don't think that's going to happen. And it just seems the height of fantasy, that they can design this stuff, come up with it, and then take themselves seriously in terms of how they're going about planning it. I think a lot of people are just waiting for this moment to pass and waiting for this kind of thing to crumble, and then you're back at regular misery as opposed to misery plus fantasy kind of thing on top of colonial fantasy on top of that. So
I think that's a really good point, Karim. I think that's a really excellent point. I think that's exactly true. In the end, there is something called history, and there's something called reality. Sadi, what did you make of it?
I mean, this is it's very dark, but this is what we've been talking about for some time on this podcast too. This is the test of our times. This is
no doubt
the test of our times. In other words, if they succeed, that's what the future Gaza is what everybody's future looks like. If they fail, Zionism is done. So I mean, this is like, this is where we are right now. I still think, insofar as their survival as a project in Palestine depends on the extraction of support, because they could not do what they do without American support. It's not possible.
Impossible.
So the continued extraction of that support can no longer depend on what it depended on for 75, 80 years. In fact, the prehistory of Zionism going back to the 19th century.
Well, they're already planning.
Which is this. I know. I realize that. But my point is, they used to be able to count on cultural hegemony. They've lost that hegemony. They've lost the narrative. That part of it is over. Now they think they can continue to extract support by sheer repression and coercion. I don't think like, in principle, it should not be possible for a distant, basically insignificant country to coerce a gigantic superpower of 360 million people to bend a superpower to its will. They think that they can. So far, of course, they are. How long that can go on, and to what extent it can go on, but we've talked on this show about the forms of resistance they're engendering, both on the left and on the right in the U.S. I don't think they have a very easy path ahead for them, and that's what in order for this nightmare in Gaza and Palestine to continue, it depends on Zionism being able to continue to extract what it needs from the U.S. I would like to think that is a doomed proposition on their part, but obviously we're going to find out.
I think before we close, I think we should acknowledge the kind of work that Sharif and Dropsite and Jeremy Scahill and all these people kind of the volume and the effort to just lay down things, put the facts, put the stories correct, so that the rest of us can have something to hold on to as we kind of move forward. But so I just want to.
Well said, Karim.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And of course, we should have asked. We could have. I mean, we'll have him on again, inshallah. But like the difference between what they're doing on drop site as opposed to all the other mainstream sources where Gaza has disappeared, even though the Israelis are killing people day in, day out.
And they're still killing journalists. And they're still targeting and killing
and journalists and people and babies and children and the tents being washed away. It's all disappeared from the news. And not just Barry Weiss's news, but like everybody else's news too. So yeah, thank goodness for drop site.
Okay, guys. Yeah.
All right, thank you guys.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye.